The air smelled of gun oil and dry dust that morning, the kind of scent that clings to a military range where steel targets stand under the sun like silent challengers. A crowd had gathered just beyond the firing line, a mix of off-duty soldiers, local civilians invited for the open demonstration, and a handful of men in fatigues who stood with arms folded, chests puffed, and eyes gleaming with the smug pride that comes from years of training. At the center of it all was Lieutenant Commander Harris, a decorated Navy SEAL officer whose reputation preceded him everywhere he went. He had the jawline carved by discipline, the eyes of a man who had seen war, and the mouth of someone who rarely offered praise unless it was to his own. Harris had just finished a demonstration that left the crowd clapping politely, hitting a steel silhouette target at 600 yards with his sniper rifle, his every move calculated with the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. When the applause dwindled, Harris set the rifle down on its bipod and gestured with a dramatic sweep toward the farthest end of the range where a small steel plate had been hung, barely larger than a man's fist and so distant it looked like a shimmer against the horizon. "No one here can hit that," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of command and the sneer of a challenge. "Not even half of you could see it without optics. That's a shot only men like me can dream of making." His words rolled through the crowd like a challenge that wasn't meant to be answered, his smirk daring anyone foolish enough to speak up. Most people didn't. Soldiers who knew better stayed quiet because they respected rank, and civilians stayed silent because they feared humiliation. It seemed as though the officer's boast would hang in the air unchallenged, yet there was always one person in every crowd who refused to bow to arrogance. From the back row, a soft female voice carried over the murmur, "I can hit it." The words weren't shouted, they were spoken with a calmness that made people turn their heads faster than if she had yelled. There she stood, a woman in plain clothes, her hair tied back in a messy knot, a simple denim jacket covering her shoulders, and no outward sign that she belonged among warriors or sharpshooters. She looked ordinary, almost forgettable, the kind of face you would pass in a grocery store without turning for a second glance. And yet, in that moment, the ordinary became extraordinary, because her words had cut through the officer's arrogance like a blade. Harris barked a laugh that sounded more like a cough of disbelief. "You?" His smirk widened, and he turned fully to face her, squinting as though to make sure he had heard correctly. "Lady, this isn't some carnival game. That's 900 yards on a plate the size of a coffee cup. You couldn't even see it, let alone hit it." His words drew chuckles from the uniformed men around him, the kind of laugh that comes when the powerful expect the powerless to crumble. The woman, however, didn't blush, didn't stammer, didn't back away. She simply walked forward, each step steady, her eyes not on the officer but on the target shimmering in the distance. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people began whispering, wondering who she was. Some assumed she was foolish, others thought she was brave, but everyone agreed on one thing: she was about to be humiliated in front of a decorated SEAL. "What's your name?" Harris demanded, his tone the way one might question a child claiming to outswim a shark. "Claire," she answered simply, her voice steady. "And I can hit it." Harris shook his head, laughing again, but there was a flicker in his eyes, the kind of flicker that every seasoned man knows when he senses something is not as it seems. "Claire," he repeated as though testing the sound of it. "Do you have any idea what it takes to put a bullet on that steel? The wind alone will eat you alive. The mirage off the ground will lie to your eyes. It's not luck, it's science and skill. Years of training." "And yet," she replied, finally turning her eyes on him, calm and unshaken, "I can hit it." The crowd went dead silent. The tension between arrogance and quiet confidence clashed like two storms colliding. Harris felt the need to end it quickly, to put her in her place before his authority was chipped. "Fine," he said, pointing at the sniper rifle resting on the bipod. "Prove it. One shot. You miss, you walk away, and you don't waste our time again." His words were designed to trap her into retreat, to make the stakes feel unbearable, but Claire merely stepped forward. People moved aside, murmuring as she passed, and she walked with none of the swagger of a trained operator, none of the calculated intimidation. She simply moved like someone who had decided, long before speaking, that she would not be shaken. When she reached the rifle, she crouched gracefully and ran her hands along its length with a familiarity that startled those watching. Fingers traced the stock, adjusted the scope, checked the bolt. She didn't fumble, didn't hesitate, didn't look like someone trying to mimic what she had seen on television. She looked like someone who had lived behind a rifle before. Harris frowned, arms crossing, his smirk faltering as the crowd leaned in, suddenly sensing that perhaps the ordinary woman wasn't ordinary at all. Claire settled behind the rifle, cheek pressed to the stock, her body aligning with a precision that whispered of long practice. The chatter died entirely. The only sounds were the wind brushing across the barren range and the creak of her breath. Time seemed to slow, stretching thin as she adjusted the scope and let her gaze settle on the target glimmering nearly a kilometer away. She adjusted the turrets with the ease of someone who knew not just the math but the feel of shooting. Clicks echoed softly, tiny sounds that made Harris's brow tighten. How could she know to do that? She steadied her breathing, letting her chest rise and fall until her heartbeat slowed to a steady drum she could count between. The world narrowed to the rifle, the target, the invisible line of wind between them. Harris leaned in, his mocking grin trying to resurface, but his eyes betrayed unease. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the impossible. Claire squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the air, echoing across the range, and for a heartbeat the bullet was just a whisper traveling through unseen currents. Then, clang. The steel plate rang, a sharp metallic note that cut the silence and left everyone frozen. The impossible had just been done, not by the decorated seal, but by a simple woman who had stepped from the crowd. Harris's mouth hung open, words robbed from him, while the crowd erupted into gasps and cheers. Claire lifted her head from the rifle, her expression calm, almost casual, as if what she had done was not miraculous but expected. She rose, brushed the dust from her knees, and handed the rifle back toward Harris without so much as a gloating smile. "Told you," she said simply and walked back toward the crowd, leaving the officer staring after her, his pride fractured in front of everyone. The clang of the steel still echoed in Harris's mind long after the crowd had erupted into cheers, their voices rising with disbelief and awe, some clapping, others simply staring at Claire as though she had just defied the laws of physics. Harris stood rooted to the spot, his jaw tightening, his pride stinging like an open wound. He had expected laughter, embarrassment, a swift retreat, but instead she had delivered perfection with the ease of someone swatting a fly. Around him, the murmurs shifted from admiration for the officer to admiration for the woman, and he could feel the ground of authority slipping beneath his boots. It wasn't just that she had made the shot, it was how she had done it, calm, precise, without drama, like someone intimately familiar with the language of rifles. That unsettled him more than the ringing steel. "Who is she?" one of the younger soldiers whispered nearby, his tone filled with awe. "Nobody," Harris muttered under his breath, but the word tasted sour. He had commanded men in deserts and jungles, had survived firefights that left lesser men broken, had trained for years in the art of war, and now his authority was being quietly dismantled by a woman in a denim jacket. It gnawed at him. He tried to laugh it off, clapping his hands and addressing the crowd as though it had all been part of the show. "Well," he said, his voice louder than necessary, "seems luck is smiling on her today. Even a broken clock is right twice a day, huh?" The laughter that followed was thin, polite, and it stung worse than silence. People weren't laughing with him, they were humoring him. The crowd wasn't fooled. Those who had watched her movements, the way she had adjusted the scope, the way she had breathed, knew it wasn't luck. She had known exactly what she was doing. Harris felt the urge to prove himself again, to restore order, so he dropped to the rifle, adjusted it back and fired his own shot at the same plate. Clang. The steel rang again, but the crowd only offered a scattered clap. It wasn't impressive anymore, it was expected of him. His victory tasted like ashes compared to hers. Claire, meanwhile, had already blended back into the crowd, her expression serene, as though she had not just shifted the hierarchy of the entire gathering. Harris found himself staring after her, his mind replaying the tiny details, the way her fingers had clicked the turrets with practiced confidence, the way her breath had steadied before the shot. That was no lucky civilian. That was someone with training, maybe even mastery. And yet, he didn't recognize her face, didn't remember ever serving with her or hearing her name in the whispered circles of elite shooters. His pride demanded an answer. After the range officially closed, after the crowd had thinned, Harris lingered by the equipment table, his jaw set. A few of his men exchanged amused looks, daring not to tease him openly but clearly savoring the rare crack in his unshakable pride. One of them, a broad-shouldered petty officer named Lopez, finally broke the silence. "Sir, with respect, that wasn't luck. She handled that rifle like she's been living behind one her whole life. You saw the way she—" "Enough," Harris snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut. Lopez clamped his mouth shut, but the truth hung in the air anyway. Harris knew it. When he turned, he saw Claire walking away down the gravel path toward the parking lot, her simple denim jacket swaying slightly with her steps, her figure swallowed by the fading light. Without thinking, Harris grabbed his cap and followed. He caught up to her just as she reached a dusty old pickup truck parked at the far edge, the kind of vehicle that spoke of small-town life, not military contracts. She opened the door and Harris called out, "Claire." She paused, her hand resting on the handle, then turned slowly, her eyes calm but sharp, the same look she'd had when staring downrange. "Yes." "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" The question came out harsher than he intended, as though he were interrogating her, and he quickly realized how desperate it sounded. She tilted her head slightly, considering him, then shrugged. "Some things you don't learn," she replied, "you just live." It was an answer that both satisfied nothing and everything at once. Harris frowned. "You don't just walk onto a military range and nail a 900-yard shot without training." "Who taught you? Army? Marines? Private contractor?" "None of those," she said simply and opened the door wider. "I appreciate the demonstration, Commander. You've got good form. But don't assume you're the only one who knows how to shoot." The jab was subtle but sharp enough to sting. Harris stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't like mysteries on my range. You don't just show up, outshoot me, and vanish without an explanation. Who are you really?" Claire studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing in a way that made him feel uncomfortably exposed, as though she could see through the uniform, through the layers of arrogance and pride, straight into the restless man underneath. Finally she said, "I'm someone who doesn't need your approval to know what I can do." Then she slid into the truck, turned the engine over and drove away, leaving Harris standing in the dust, his questions swirling louder than the engine's growl. That night Harris couldn't sleep. He sat in his quarters with the rifle across his lap, staring at it as though it had betrayed him. His mind replayed every detail of her stance, her control, the way she had said she didn't need his approval. It was maddening. He prided himself on knowing every shooter worth their salt in the country, every name that whispered through special operations circles, and yet he had never heard of Claire. If she wasn't military, then who was she? A forgotten Olympian? A rancher's daughter raised with a rifle in her hands? A professional competitor hiding in plain sight? His mind spiraled with possibilities, each one more frustrating than the last. Over the next few days Harris tried to put it behind him, but the whispers followed. Soldiers joked in the mess hall about the denim sniper, civilians who had attended the demonstration posted online about the woman who had embarrassed a SEAL officer, and even his superiors made offhand remarks about how maybe they should recruit more ordinary talent. His reputation wasn't ruined, but it had been dented, and Harris wasn't a man who tolerated dents. He decided he needed answers. With the help of a friend in logistics, he tracked the registration of that old pickup truck to a small town 2 hours away, a rural place nestled between rolling hills and farmland. On a Saturday morning, dressed down in jeans and a plain shirt to avoid standing out, Harris drove there. The town was quiet, the kind of place where the diner served as both a restaurant and a gossip hub, where people waved at strangers just because they passed. Harris felt out of place, his military posture too rigid for the easygoing air. He asked a few questions casually at the diner, dropping Claire's name, and received nods of recognition. "Claire Reynolds?" the waitress asked, setting down his coffee. "Sure, she lives out on Miller's Ridge. Keeps to herself mostly. Sweet girl. Why do you ask?" Harris mumbled something about being an old friend, and the waitress smiled knowingly, as small-town waitresses often do when they sense a story. He left a tip and drove out toward Miller's Ridge, the road winding past fields and barns until it reached a modest farmhouse perched at the edge of a wooded lot. The truck was there, parked in the gravel drive. Harris parked a little ways down and walked up, his boots crunching softly. He wasn't sure what he expected, maybe to find a wall of medals, a hidden training ground, some evidence that would explain everything. Instead he found simplicity. The house was small but well kept, the garden neat, the air filled with the scent of cut grass and blooming wildflowers. Claire emerged from the barn, a basket in her hand, dressed in the same unassuming style as before. She spotted him immediately and didn't look surprised. "You don't give up, do you?" she asked, setting the basket down on a bench. Harris stopped a few paces away, shifting awkwardly. "I had to know. Who are you really?" She wiped her hands on her jeans and gave a faint smile. "I told you already. I'm Claire." "That's not enough," he insisted, his voice carrying the edge of desperation. "People don't just make shots like that. Not even most SEALs could." She studied him, then motioned toward the porch. "If you're going to ask questions, at least sit down first." He hesitated, then followed her up the steps, the wood creaking beneath their weight. She poured him a glass of water from a pitcher and handed it over. Harris sat stiffly, staring at her as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve. Finally she said, You want the truth? Fine. But you won't like it. Because it'll mean admitting you're not the only one who knows what it takes. Harris leaned forward, his pride battling his curiosity. For the first time in years, he felt the strange sensation of being the student instead of the teacher. Claire leaned back against the porch railing, her arms folding across her chest, her expression as calm as the rolling fields behind her, and for a long moment she said nothing, letting the silence stretch until Harris shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It was not the silence of someone unsure of what to say but the silence of someone measuring whether the other person was ready to hear it. Finally she spoke, her voice low but steady, carrying the kind of weight that didn't need to be forced. My father wasn't a soldier, she began, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, but he might as well have been. He grew up in these hills, hunting before he could walk properly, working the land, and he believed that a rifle wasn't just a tool for survival, it was an extension of who you were. He taught me to shoot before I could even spell my name. While other kids were learning to ride their bikes, I was learning windage, elevation, how to feel the earth and read the sky. He didn't care about trophies or medals. He cared about discipline, patience, and respect for every shot you ever took. Harris listened, his fingers tightening around the glass of water in his hand, the words igniting something deep inside him because they sounded less like the story of a hobby and more like the foundation of a life forged in precision. Claire continued, her voice unbroken. When I was 12, he'd set up targets out past 500 yards, bottles or small plates that shimmered in the heat, and he wouldn't let me leave the range until I hit them. He wasn't cruel, he just believed that if you were going to do something you did it right, no excuses. By the time I was 16 I could outshoot him. He never admitted it out loud but I saw it in his eyes. And that's when he pushed me harder, not because he wanted to break me but because he believed in what I could do. She paused, sipping her own water, her eyes narrowing slightly as though revisiting memories she rarely allowed herself to touch. After he died it was just me and the land. I didn't have a team, a unit, or a commander barking orders. I had silence and targets and the discipline he drilled into me. People call it talent but it wasn't, it was years of repetition, sweat, failure, and getting back up again. By the time I was 20, hitting a 900-yard plate wasn't a miracle. It was just Tuesday. Harris felt a strange tightening in his chest, equal parts admiration and frustration. He had trained in deserts under blistering suns, in mountains where oxygen thinned, in scenarios designed to simulate chaos and combat, and yet here was a woman who had lived a parallel life of discipline without ever stepping into uniform. He leaned forward, his pride cracking enough to let curiosity through. So why hide it? Why live out here on a farm when you could be making a career with those skills? Do you realize what units like mine would pay for someone like you? Claire gave a faint smile, but it was tinged with sadness. Because a rifle in my hands isn't for glory or money. My father taught me it was about respect. For the land, for the shot, for what it means to pull that trigger. I never wanted to use it to kill, Commander. I wanted to use it to understand myself, to stay connected to him. Joining the military, selling that skill, it would have twisted what it meant for me. Out here, I answer to no one but myself. Harris swallowed hard, struggling to reconcile his worldview with hers. For him, a rifle was a weapon, a tool of war, a way to impose order in a chaotic world. For her, it was a connection, a discipline, almost a form of meditation. The contrast unsettled him, because deep down he could feel the purity in her reasoning, and it cast a shadow on his own justifications. But you embarrassed me, he said finally, his tone carrying more vulnerability than he intended. Out there, in front of everyone, you humiliated a decorated officer. You made me look like a fool. Claire's eyes locked onto his, calm but unflinching. No, Commander. I didn't make you look like a fool. Your arrogance did that. You stood there and told the world no one could hit that shot. You didn't say no one but you. You dismissed every possibility that someone else could rise to the challenge. I didn't prove you wrong to shame you. I did it because the truth is bigger than your pride. Harris opened his mouth, then closed it, her words striking deeper than he wanted to admit. He had built a career on confidence, on never showing weakness, on always being the man in control, but this woman with no medals, no uniform, no title had dismantled his facade with nothing more than a single shot and a few calm words. He stared at her, wrestling with a storm of emotions, anger, admiration, envy, respect, and for once he didn't know which one would win. Claire leaned back again, her gaze drifting to the fields. You want to know who I really am, Harris? I'm someone who spent years being underestimated, someone who learned that silence is stronger than noise, and someone who doesn't need anyone's permission to be great at what I do. You can call me a simple woman if it makes you feel better, but don't mistake simplicity for weakness. Sometimes the sharpest blades are the ones that never see battle. The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding, and Harris felt the weight of his own insecurities pressing harder than the heat of any battlefield he had ever faced. He tried to push back with the only weapon he knew, challenge. Then prove it wasn't just luck, he said, his voice sharper now. Prove it wasn't just one miracle shot. Set up again. Same distance, different target. Let's see if you can do it twice. Claire turned to him slowly, her smile faint but knowing. You still don't get it, do you? It was never about proving anything to you. I already know what I can do. Harris bristled, the fire of competition burning in his chest, but before he could argue further, she stood and walked toward the barn. But, she added, glancing back over her shoulder, if you're really that desperate to learn, I'll show you. Not because you asked, but because maybe it's time someone knocked that chip off your shoulder. Harris sat there, stunned, as she disappeared into the barn. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a long wooden case, the kind used for competition rifles, worn at the edges but polished with care. She set it on the porch table, unlatching it with practiced ease, and revealed a custom-built rifle that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Harris leaned forward, his eyes widening despite himself. It was beautiful, sleek lines, polished stock, a scope that wasn't military issue but high-end competition grade. This wasn't a hobbyist toy. This was a precision instrument, crafted for someone who understood every nuance of ballistics. Claire lifted it with reverence, setting it gently across her lap. This was my father's, she said softly. He built it piece by piece, tuning every detail until it felt like part of him. When he passed, it became part of me. Every shot I take with this isn't just mine, it's his too. That's why I don't miss. Harris felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall of arrogance he had spent years building. He saw, for the first time, not just a woman who had outshot him, but a person whose life had been forged in discipline, patience, and quiet mastery. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, humility. The next morning the sun rose over Miller's Ridge with a golden haze, spilling across the fields and the wooden porch where Harris sat stiffly, his hands clasped in front of him as if bracing for battle, though the only war he was about to fight was inside himself. Claire emerged from the barn with her father's rifle case in one hand and a metal target in the other, walking with the easy stride of someone who had already decided the outcome long before it began. Harris watched her, pride knotting his chest, because never in his career had he thought he would be waiting on the instruction of someone who didn't wear a uniform, didn't hold rank, and yet held authority over him with nothing but the proof of her skill. She set the target down in the truck bed, glanced at him and said simply, "If you're serious, follow me." There was no flourish, no smugness, just certainty, and that cut deeper than any taunt could have. Harris rose, straightened his shoulders out of habit, and followed her down a dirt road that wound into the hills until it opened into a clearing where the earth had been flattened and scarred by years of spent casings and distant shots. It was her range, a private sanctuary carved from the land itself, with markers at different distances, a weathered bench and poles for hanging steel plates. Claire set the case on the bench, unlatched it, and revealed her father's rifle, laying it out like a ritual. Then she motioned for Harris to hang the steel downrange. He hesitated for a second. He was used to giving orders, not taking them, but something in her calm gaze compelled him forward. Without a word, he carried the heavy plate, trudging across the clearing, planting it at nearly 1,000 yards, then walking back with sweat dampening his collar. When he returned, she was already setting the rifle up, her movements fluid and unhurried. "You think you know rifles," she said without looking at him, her hands adjusting the scope with delicate precision, "but all your training has taught you to shoot under orders, with a mission, under pressure. You've never learned what it means to shoot when no one's watching, when the only standard is perfection you set for yourself." Harris bristled, his instinct to argue rising, but he forced it down. Instead he asked, "And what are you going to teach me that I haven't already learned in the teams?" She looked at him then, eyes steady. "Patience, humility, listening." The words stung more than bullets. She motioned for him to take the rifle. "Go ahead. Show me what you've got." Harris dropped prone, settling behind the rifle with the practiced ease of years. His body aligned, his cheek welded to the stock, his breathing controlled. He squeezed off a shot, the rifle cracking, and after a few seconds the bullet struck, but wide, missing the plate. He muttered under his breath, adjusted, fired again and missed again. By the third miss, frustration flared hot in his chest, his jaw clenching. He rolled onto his side, glaring at the rifle as though it had betrayed him. Claire crouched beside him, her voice quiet but cutting. "You're fighting it. You're forcing the shot instead of letting it happen. You're treating it like a target you have to conquer instead of something you have to understand. He barked a laugh. Understand? It's a piece of steel. And the wind is just air, right? She countered. But it moves the bullet. You can't ignore it just because you don't want it there. Every element matters, every detail, and if you're too proud to listen to what the world is telling you, you'll always miss. Harris stared at her, his pride boiling, but beneath it he felt a truth he couldn't deny. He exhaled sharply, rolling back behind the rifle. This time he forced himself to slow down, to hear her voice as she guided him. Feel the wind. Don't just glance at the grass. Watch how it sways, how it shifts. Breathe with it. Just a little left, just a click more. Good. Now don't rush the trigger. Let it surprise you. He listened, adjusting as instructed, and when he fired, the shot rang truer, closer, but still not perfect. The bullet smacked the edge of the plate, making it wobble but not clang. He cursed under his breath, but Claire only nodded. Better. You're learning. Now again. For the next hour, she guided him through every shot, her patience unshakable even as his frustration boiled over. He wanted to master it instantly to prove himself, but she forced him to slow, to unlearn habits built in combat where speed and aggression mattered more than stillness. At one point, when his temper threatened to break, she simply sat back and said, "You'll never hit it until you stop trying to beat it. This isn't war, Harris. It's precision. And precision doesn't care about your pride." Something in her tone, the calm certainty, cracked him deeper than he expected. He ground his teeth, fired again, and this time the steel rang, a clean clang that echoed across the clearing. He felt a rush of triumph rise in him, but Claire only gave a faint smile. Now do it again. And again. Until it's not luck. Until it's who you are. By midday his body ached, his shirt was damp with sweat, and his pride had been sanded down by hours of quiet correction. He hated how much she was right, hated that he had to be taught, but beneath it all, a strange respect had begun to grow. He saw that her skill wasn't arrogance, it was born of discipline so pure it didn't need arrogance. She didn't gloat when he missed, didn't boast when he hit. She simply taught, steady and unyielding, and for the first time he began to understand that mastery wasn't about proving yourself to others, but proving yourself to yourself. They took a break beneath the shade of an old oak at the edge of the clearing, sharing water in silence until Harris finally spoke. You know, I've been through every kind of training there is. I've jumped from planes in the dead of night, swum miles under crushing waves, marched until my body gave out. And yet this is harder. Claire looked at him, her expression unreadable. Because you can't muscle through it. You can't outfight the wind or the distance. You have to surrender to it. That's something you're not used to. Harris gave a humorless chuckle. Surrender isn't in my vocabulary. Maybe it should be, she said softly. The words lingered in the air, and for a moment neither of them looked away. He felt an odd pull in his chest, something more than respect, though he shoved it down quickly. When they returned to the range, Harris threw himself into the practice again, each shot a battle not with the steel but with himself. Claire remained by his side, her guidance never harsh, never mocking, always steady. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and purple, Harris had landed shot after shot, not perfect every time but consistent, deliberate, controlled. He lay back in the grass, chest heaving, the clangs of the steel still ringing in his ears, and for the first time in years he felt not victorious but humbled. Claire sat beside him, the rifle resting across her lap, and said, "You're starting to get it. Not because you're strong, not because you're decorated, but because you're finally listening." Harris turned his head toward her, sweat streaking his brow, and for once he didn't argue. He just nodded because she was right, and admitting it didn't feel like weakness anymore. It felt like truth. The day after Rachel's stunning display, the base carried an energy unlike anything it had known before. Rumors spread like wildfire. Soldiers whispered her name in the mess hall, engineers discussed her uncanny accuracy while servicing vehicles, and even the medical staff brought up her performance during quiet hours. It wasn't just that she had outshot a Navy SEAL officer, it was the way she did it, calm, precise and unshaken. No theatrics, no hesitation, only skill. The simplicity of her act made it undeniable. Yet for Rachel, life had not suddenly transformed into fame and glory. She woke early as always, fed her chickens, gathered eggs, and went about her morning with quiet determination, pretending not to notice the dozens of curious stares that followed her whenever she walked past groups of men. But deep inside she felt the change pressing at her, an invisible shift, like a tide that couldn't be ignored. Captain Harris, however, felt a very different weight. His pride had been cut open in front of his men, and though no one mocked him openly, He could feel the silent judgment in every nod, every handshake, every exchange. A SEAL officer scoffing at a target as impossible, only to be proven wrong by a woman from the local countryside. It had become legend overnight. Harris had never considered himself arrogant. He demanded excellence because he believed in excellence. But now, stripped of the illusion of invincibility, he was forced to face what lay beneath his own pride. He spent hours on the range, pushing himself harder, trying to reassert control over what had slipped away. Yet the more he fired, the more he realized his own shots weren't improving. He wasn't regressing, but the ghost of Rachel's performance haunted him. He began to wonder whether raw humility might be the only antidote to his restless shame. Meanwhile, Colonel Whitmore saw an opportunity. He was not only a commander but also a strategist of perception. The demonstration with Rachel had drawn attention from higher up the chain of command, and questions were already arriving from regional leaders. Who was this woman, and how had she achieved what so many soldiers could not? Whitmore considered inviting her back formally, not for one stunt but for a series of lessons and perhaps even a training module. She didn't have the resume, but she had results. And the military respected results above all else. Yet Whitmore knew he needed to approach her carefully. Rachel had not asked for attention, nor had she sought the spotlight. If she were pushed too fast, she might retreat back to her quiet farm and refuse further involvement. He decided to send Elias first, the medic who had bonded with Rachel during her first visit, to gauge her interest. Elias welcomed the errand. He had felt something stirring during their conversations, something beyond respect, though he wasn't yet willing to name it. Arriving at her farm in his old Jeep, he found Rachel repairing a fence post, sweat glistening on her forehead, her hands steady and practical as she hammered nails into the wood. He hesitated, then approached, his voice light. "Morning, Rachel. Still fixing everything yourself?" She gave him a sideways glance, then smiled faintly. "The world doesn't stop breaking things, Elias. Someone has to keep it together." He laughed, but his purpose pressed at him, and after a short silence, he told her why he had come. Her brow furrowed as he explained Whitmore's idea, and when he finished, she leaned against the fence, thinking deeply. "I'm not a soldier," she said quietly. "I don't belong in your world." Elias shook his head. "Maybe not in uniform. But you've got something our world needs. Skill, calm under pressure, and the ability to humble men who think they've seen it all. That's rare, Rachel. Really rare." For several days she wrestled with the idea. Part of her longed for the quiet routine of her farm, safe from the noise and demands of others. But another part, the one she usually buried, felt alive in the memory of that shot, in the silence that followed when men stood dumbfounded at what she'd done. She wasn't vain, but she recognized the truth. She had something unusual, something valuable. Could it be wrong to hide it away? Finally, she gave her answer to Elias. "I'll help. But only if I can do it my way. No uniforms, no chains of command. Just me teaching what I know." Elias agreed, relieved, and promised to deliver her conditions to Whitmore. Within weeks, Rachel returned to the base. This time it wasn't for a stunt but for structured sessions. Her first group consisted of young recruits, men and women alike, their eagerness written across their faces. They expected techniques, secret tricks, perhaps even mystical advice. Instead, Rachel began with silence. She stood in front of them, holding a rifle, and said nothing for a full minute. Only when the recruits grew restless did she finally speak. "You're impatient. That's your first problem. Shooting isn't about speed, it's about patience. A bullet leaves you faster than you can blink, but if you rush before you're ready, the shot is already lost." Her voice was steady, unadorned, carrying the same quiet conviction she lived by. By the end of the session, the recruits weren't laughing or restless anymore. They were listening. Harris watched from a distance, arms crossed, jaw tight. It gnawed at him to see his men captivated by her. Yet a strange respect began to creep into his bitterness. She wasn't showboating. She wasn't exploiting her victory over him. She was simply teaching, and teaching well. The recruits who had struggled with accuracy showed measurable improvement after a few days under her guidance. Harris himself found his pride dissolving into curiosity. He attended one of her sessions disguised as an observer, telling himself it was just professional oversight. But when Rachel began demonstrating breathing techniques, he realized with a jolt that her methods were sound, simple yes, but rooted in truths that even advanced training often neglected. It struck him that maybe, just maybe, her victory over him had been more than chance. Word spread beyond the base. Journalists caught whispers of a civilian woman training military personnel, and soon stories leaked to local papers. Rachel became a reluctant symbol, hailed as the simple woman who taught soldiers patience. Some critics dismissed her involvement as a publicity stunt, but the results silenced many of them. Accuracy scores rose across the unit, and morale seemed to shift, anchored by the lesson that greatness could emerge from anywhere, even from someone who never sought recognition. Rachel avoided interviews, refusing to play the role of celebrity, but the attention made her uneasy. Late at night, sitting on her porch with Elias, she confessed her fears. "I never wanted to be known. Fame eats people alive. I just wanted to live quietly, do what I can." Elias listened, his hand resting near hers, and whispered, "Maybe this isn't fame, Rachel. Maybe it's service. You're helping more people than you realize." The more she taught, the more Rachel began to understand her own gift. It wasn't just her aim, it was her perspective. She approached shooting not as domination but as harmony, finding stillness, connecting body and breath, and letting the shot reveal itself rather than forcing it. She realized this mindset wasn't just for rifles, it was for life. Soldiers began to repeat her words back to each other in moments of stress. "Slow down. Breathe. Let the moment come." What had begun as a humiliating spectacle for one officer had become a cultural shift for an entire unit. Harris, for the first time in years, felt something loosen in his chest. Perhaps he wasn't the man with all the answers. Perhaps humility itself was a kind of weapon, sharper and more necessary than pride. By the end of her first month as an informal instructor, Rachel stood before a group of recruits who had just completed their training cycle. They looked sharper, steadier, and more focused than before. Colonel Whitmore shook her hand publicly, offering words of gratitude that drew cheers from the soldiers. Yet Rachel remained calm, her expression humble, almost distant. Later, when the applause had faded and the sun dipped below the horizon, she returned home, fed her chickens, and sat on her porch, staring at the fading light. She wasn't sure what the future held, or how long she would continue at the base. But one thing was certain: she had changed the course of many lives simply by doing what came naturally to her. And somewhere in the shadows, Harris finally admitted aloud to no one but himself, "No one can hit that? I was wrong. She could. She did. And she'll keep doing it." The storm outside Camp Sentinel had passed overnight, leaving the desert washed clean, the ground packed firm with rain, and the air crisp in the early morning light. When the sun broke across the ridgelines, it struck every puddle with a flash of gold, and the entire valley seemed to shimmer as though sprinkled with molten metal. Inside the camp, however, the mood was anything but serene. The challenge that had been whispered about, mocked, and finally accepted had now transformed into something bigger than anyone originally imagined. It was no longer about a Navy SEAL officer's arrogance, nor even about a simple woman showing she could shoot. It had turned into a crucible of pride, reputation, and the fragile human need to prove worth when doubted. That morning, men carried ammunition crates, measured distance markers, and reinforced target stands as if preparing for a high-stakes military test. They might have been setting up for a qualification shoot for the most elite units in the world. In truth, all of this was to see if one woman, Emily from the ranch, could do the impossible a second time, under stricter conditions with everyone watching. Captain Donovan strode into the firing range area, his boots crunching on gravel. He carried himself stiffly, jaw set, the corners of his mouth drawn down in grim determination. He had not slept well. The humiliation of being shown up by a civilian in front of his men ate at him, twisting his thoughts like barbed wire. He told himself he had agreed to extend the challenge not out of desperation to reclaim pride, but for the sake of fairness. A fluke could not be accepted as truth, and the integrity of the skills his men bled to perfect had to be protected. If Emily could repeat her feat, if she could hit not one but 3 impossibly distant, irregularly placed targets in succession, then Donovan would concede and perhaps even admire her. But he did not expect her to succeed. He needed her failure, craved it, because only then would order be restored. Emily walked onto the range quietly, wearing the same flannel shirt and jeans she had worn the first time. The only addition was the gift from the SEAL who had befriended her the day before. A pair of protective earmuffs and safety glasses, slightly too large for her but carefully adjusted to fit. She carried her old rifle again, the wooden stock worn smooth with age, the barrel polished not by modern oils but by decades of careful cleaning. She looked almost absurd in the middle of all the high-tech scopes, laser rangefinders, spotting drones, and matte black assault rifles leaning against crates. But what caught everyone's eye was not her gear, it was her calmness. She looked neither proud nor anxious. Her expression was steady, her breathing easy, as if this were just another morning at her ranch watching the cattle graze. The men gathered again, this time in greater numbers. Rumor of the first contest had spread across nearby bases, and a convoy of off-duty Marines, Rangers, and even a few Air Force special operators had come to witness the event. Journalists were not allowed inside Camp Sentinel, but phones discreetly lifted toward the range made it clear this story would not remain secret for long. Men whispered in disbelief, in awe, in mockery, in support. Every shade of opinion ran through the crowd like currents in a stormy sea. The one unifying thing was anticipation. Everyone wanted to see whether lightning could strike twice. Chief Petty Officer Hale stepped forward as range officer. He had been skeptical at first, but something about Emily's unflinching composure now made him pause. He barked orders with his usual authority. Targets are set. 3 steel silhouettes. Distances, 1 at 1,800 yards, 1 at 2,200 yards, last at 2,500. That's over 1.5 miles on the final. Wind shifting 5 to 7 knots cross range, decreasing visibility at intervals. Shooter must hit each target once in order, no more than 5 rounds per target. Failure at any stage ends the challenge. Clear? His voice rang across the range like a bell. Emily simply nodded. Donovan stood with arms crossed, eyes locked on her. Inside, his mind roared with conflicting thoughts. He remembered his own training, long weeks in sniper school, the agony of learning to read mirage, wind, humidity. He remembered missing shots and instructors screaming at him until he got them right. He remembered how many men washed out. He remembered what it had cost him to stand here, wearing the trident of a Navy SEAL. And now, a ranch woman with no formal training was about to attempt a shot harder than most combat snipers would ever risk. The unfairness burned his chest like acid.